You sleep 8 hours, you wake up, and the first thing your body registers isn't refreshment, it's weight, a kind of heaviness that has nothing to do with how long you were in bed. You go through the motions of the morning, and somewhere around mid-afternoon, you realize you've been tired this entire time. Not sleepy, just tired. There's a difference, and most people have never stopped to examine it. This is more common than the statistics suggest, not because people are lazy, not because they're weak, and not because something is catastrophically wrong with them. It happens because the kind of exhaustion they're carrying isn't the kind that sleep was designed to fix. The common assumption is straightforward. If you're tired, you need more rest. And if rest doesn't work, then either you're not resting properly or there's a medical explanation waiting to be found. That's where most conversations stop, at the surface. But the psychology beneath this experience is considerably more layered than a sleep hygiene checklist can address. What researchers have found, particularly over the last 2 decades of studying fatigue and cognitive load, is that tiredness operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is physical tiredness, muscle fatigue, cellular recovery, the biological need for sleep. And then there is something that sits deeper than that. Something that runs in the background of a person's day regardless of how rested their body is. Scientists sometimes call it mental fatigue or cognitive overload, but those labels don't quite capture the full picture either. What's actually happening in the brain of someone who feels chronically tired despite adequate rest is, in part, a story about the default mode network. This is the neurosystem that activates when the brain isn't focused on a specific task, when you're lying in bed, when you're staring out a window, when you're technically doing nothing. In people who carry significant psychological weight, this network doesn't quiet down. It keeps running, it keeps processing, and that processing has a metabolic cost. The brain accounts for roughly 20% of the body's total energy use, and a default mode network that never truly idles burns through that energy whether the person is asleep or awake. This is why someone can sleep a full night and still wake up feeling like they never stopped working, because neurologically, they didn't. But it goes further than neural activity. There's a concept in psychology called emotional labor, the ongoing effort of managing internal states, regulating emotions, maintaining composure in environments that demand it. For a long time, emotional labor was studied primarily in workplace settings. What emerged more recently is the understanding that this kind of labor doesn't stay at work. It travels, it accumulates, and it doesn't register as work in the traditional sense, which means it rarely gets treated as something that needs recovery time. A person who has spent years managing high-stress relationships, navigating uncertainty, suppressing emotional responses in professional or social environments, that person is carrying a fatigue load that a weekend of sleep cannot touch. A 2017 study examining emotional regulation and subjective fatigue found that individuals who reported high levels of daily emotional suppression consistently rated their tiredness as disproportionate to their physical activity. Their bodies weren't worn out. Their regulatory systems were. This doesn't mean everyone who feels this way has been through something dramatic. That's an important distinction. The exhaustion isn't necessarily tied to crisis. It can come from something much quieter, from years of low-grade vigilance, from growing up in environments where unpredictability was the norm, from living a life where the internal world is rarely given space to simply exist without being monitored or managed. The prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with planning, decision-making, and emotional regulation, is particularly sensitive to this kind of sustained demand. When it's chronically overloaded, it begins to struggle with tasks that would otherwise feel routine. Decisions feel harder, motivation flattens, simple things become effortful, and from the outside, this can look like disinterest or apathy. From the inside, it feels like being tired of everything without being able to explain why. Here's the insight that tends to reframe things. Exhaustion of this kind is often not a sign of weakness or dysfunction. It's frequently a sign of a nervous system that has been doing an enormous amount of work in invisible ways. The person who seems low energy might have a nervous system that has been running on high alert far longer than it should have. What looks like fatigue is sometimes the body's way of billing for services rendered. There is also the role of meaning and reward in this picture. The brain's dopamine system is closely tied to motivation and the anticipation of reward.
When a person's daily life is disconnected from what feels genuinely meaningful to them, when they're moving through obligations that feel hollow, ticking boxes in a life that doesn't quite feel like their own, the dopamine system becomes quieter, not absent, but muted. And a muted reward system makes everything feel more effortful than it should. Rest under these conditions restores the body, but doesn't restore the drive. You wake up rested and still feel the drag, because the drag was never about the body to begin with. This also connects to something that doesn't get discussed enough: identity fatigue. When a person spends significant portions of their life performing a version of themselves, whether for professional reasons, social reasons, or reasons rooted in earlier experiences of not feeling safe enough to be otherwise, that performance has a cost. Authenticity isn't just a philosophical concept, it has neurological weight. Research into self-discrepancy theory suggests that the gap between who a person actually is and who they feel they must present themselves as creates a persistent background stress. And background stress, over time, is exhausting in exactly the way that sleep cannot resolve. None of this is to say that physical factors are irrelevant. Iron deficiency, thyroid function, disrupted sleep architecture, these all matter and are worth examining. But they're not the full story for many people. And treating persistent fatigue purely as a physical problem while ignoring the psychological architecture beneath it is like treating a flooding room without looking for the source of the water. What this ultimately reveals is something quite human. The mind and body are not as separate as the culture tends to treat them. When the inner life is loud, unsettled, overloaded, or starved of meaning, the body knows. It registers the cost, and it sends signals in the language it knows best: tiredness, weight, a desire to stop that doesn't resolve with stopping. People who feel tired even after rest are not broken. They're not failing at self-care. They are, in many cases, people whose internal experience has been demanding more than rest can give, and who have rarely been offered a framework to understand why that might be. There is something worth sitting with in that. The tiredness isn't random. It's information. It's pointing at something, not always a catastrophic thing, but a real thing. And the first step towards understanding it is simply stopping the assumption that more sleep should have fixed it by now. If this resonated with you, you'll probably connect with the video on why some people feel emotionally exhausted even in relationships that seem healthy. It follows a lot of the same psychological thread, and it goes somewhere unexpected.